You'll often hear it said that Buddhism isn't a religion, it's a philosophy. This type of argument plays well in justifying Buddhism to a society that is sick of traditional religion. But even in a society celebrating the death of God, the search for a higher meaning does not disappear. Now, however, it must be reasonable and rational, and that, for obvious reasons, creates problems. These demands immediately rule out all the Judeo-Christian traditions. We are all too familiar with the irrational dogmas, the pomp, ritual, and common hypocrisy of it all. And so, we turn our eyes to the Orient. We look to the East, to exotic obscurities like Buddhism and Taoism. And because they are different to what we know, we use loopholes to justify them, not as despicable religions, but as noble philosophies. But there's a mistake in this thinking. There's a sense that these Oriental schools of thought are something superior to their Western counterparts. In a society growing more atheistic and reductionist, Buddhism offers a scientific religion. It seems to entail no bullshit and to speak plain truth. And without a doubt, there is an argument to be made for this, because while the Buddha did speak his fair share about gods, he didn't speak of a creator god. This was for the prudent reason that his followers would undoubtedly make an idol out of something they didn't understand. This curiosity about Buddhism, however, has led many people to argue that Buddhism is an atheistic religion. It is not. It is simply that atheism in the West evolved in response to a religion based on a creator god. This cultural quirk gave rise to a certain prejudice. I've seen people protect their self-perceptions of rational atheism from their advocacy of Buddhism by leveraging this nuance. But if you're an atheistic lover of rationality, it's more difficult to mock religious believers for believing in a creator god, when you yourself endorse another religion with supernatural beliefs and gods, albeit lacking a creator god. From rebirth and karma to gods, titans and ghosts, from walking through walls to telepathy and flight, Buddhism is a cornucopia of supernatural delights. I know I'm going to come across as if I'm going after Buddhism here and suggesting that we should cast it into the fire, but it's really the patronising disdain of the rational atheist subculture that I'm targeting. This disdain for the non-rational is something we'll be returning to in a future episode on Ken Wilber's illumination of the pre/trans fallacy in the worldview of modernity. What really grinds my gears is the hypocrisy of mocking and condemning others for their magical beliefs while justifying your own tastes. So in this episode, I want to wrest Buddhism from its sanitized, rationalized Western form and restore a bit of its historical context and content, so that we might move towards a more realistic appraisal of Buddhism, and also, hopefully, a more charitable attitude towards religion in general. Perhaps, if religion has been the midwife for a toolkit of good mental health, then it shouldn't merely be discarded as a delusion or a virus, but something with a true value to human life. And of course, that's not to deny that religion is responsible for a lot of evil in the world as well. Every religion has its good and its bad points. There's something to learn from every tradition. While there is much in religion to overcome, there is also a lot to learn, and a lot that we have lost in this age of reason. In moving beyond the ages of modernity and post-modernity, there is a lot here that we will want to integrate into a broader worldview. I've had a few arguments with people over the years where they would adamantly argue that Buddhism isn't a religion, but a philosophy. There's books out there with titles like Confessions of a Buddhist Atheist and Secular Buddhism, and there's a whole swarm of articles defending the point online. Of course, for succinct manifestations of this argument, there's no better place to turn than Reddit. One thread titled "Is Buddhism a Philosophy or a Religion?" had this as its top comment. It's viewed as a religion today, but Siddhartha, who was the first Buddha, would say it's a philosophy, because the point is for everyone in Buddhism to become a Buddha, which means enlightened one. Siddhartha saw that Brahmanism was too strict and mired in ritual, which takes away from the experience of reaching enlightenment, and also that only Brahmins and their sons could be a part of monastic life. The The general idea then is that Buddhism is dramatically different from the Judeo-Christian religions our secular culture has such disdain for. Buddhism is different, we are to believe. It's like us, atheistic, pragmatic, and devoid of bullshit. But of course, this is a complete fiction, and not just with reference to Buddhism. Any bit of investigation into Buddhism would quickly disabuse the investigator of this delusion. There are plenty of ideas to pick apart here. The first difficulty one faces with proving that Buddhism is either a religion or a philosophy is that Buddhism is vast. It's a religion with 2.5 millennia of history across an entire continent. Buddhism may have started in India, but within a few short centuries it had spread south to Sri Lanka, east to the countries of Southeast Asia, including Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, Malaysia and Myanmar. It spread north to the peaks of Tibet and Nepal, and into China, and from there to Japan. In each of these countries, Buddhism took on its own local flavour. There's a traditional divide between the greater vehicle of Mahayana Buddhism that tends to dominate north of India, while the more southern Buddhist countries, such as Sri Lanka, Thailand and Myanmar, stuck with the more monastic tradition of Theravada. But no matter which slice of Buddhism you take from, you will inevitably find a rich vein of supernatural beliefs. In the Pali Canon, the holy book of the Theravadin tradition, generally considered in the West to be the more rational atheistic tradition, we find a wealth of rich mythology. In the Kavata Sutta, a treatise in the Pali Canon, a householder called Kavata asks the Buddha to display some magical powers. The Buddha responds by saying he doesn't teach this way, and such powers are not the barometer of an advanced practitioner. Nevertheless, he goes on to discuss the manifold powers of the enlightened. The advanced monk goes unimpeded through walls, ramparts and mountains, as if through space. He dives in and out of the earth as if it were water. He walks on water without sinking, as if it were dry land. Sitting cross-legged, he flies through the air like a winged bird. With his hand, he touches and strokes even the sun and moon, so mighty and powerful. And that's not all, he also has powers of telepathy. There is the case where a monk reads the minds, the mental events, the thoughts, the ponderings of other beings, other individuals, saying, "Such is your thinking. Here is where your thinking is. Thus is your mind." There is a whole section of the Pali Canon called Jataka Tales that are dedicated to the previous incarnations of Gautama Buddha. These are some of the earliest traditions we have from Buddhism and are accepted by all branches and traditions of the religion. Among these tales, we find the story of his incarnation as Prince Sattva, a prince who, out of compassion, committed suicide in order to feed a starving tigress and her cubs. Quite often, we will find our Western secular Buddhists wanting to dismiss this sort of belief. They argue that Buddhists don't actually believe these tales, since the Buddha argued that we have no self, and therefore, what is there to be reborn? Rebirth simply refers to the fact that we are reborn every moment, since there is no solid self to speak of. This line of argument has all the delicacy of a bull in a china shop. It happily dismisses one of Buddhism's oldest traditions as mere fictions, in order to retain its idea of Buddhism being all about breathing and mindfulness, pure science. The magical thinking only gets wilder as we leave the tamer Theravada tradition and head further north to the Mahayana Buddhism common in Tibet, China and Japan. One would have a hard time arguing that the monks who went searching for the rebirth of the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara were acting out of pure rationality. And I doubt their discovered quarry, who we know as the Dalai Lama, would maintain the same. Parts of the Lotus Sutra, one of the most revered texts in the Mahayana traditions, are nothing but long lists of gods. Also in this text, we find even more cool superpowers of the enlightened, including instant teleportation, shape-shifting, the divine eyes and the divine ears that make one capable of seeing anything at any distance, as well as telepathy once again, and much more. The Lotus Sutra is sacred across the Mahayana traditions, from the Tendai tradition to the Nichiren and Zen traditions. There's one other corner of the Mahayana tradition that deserves mention, and it should remind us about the very religious nature of Buddhism. This is an old disagreement between two schools of what is called Pure Land Buddhism. These sects of Buddhism believe in a Buddha called Amitabha, who's created a place that creates the perfect circumstances for becoming enlightened. To be reborn there is effectively to receive a golden ticket to nirvana. But you can only be reborn there with the grace of Buddha Amitabha, and this is where the disagreement comes from. One school of Pure Land argues that you must pray throughout your life to be reborn in the Pure Land. The other sect says that those who pray every day believe they have earned the right to be reborn in the Pure Land, and have forgotten that to be born in the Pure Land is a gift granted by Buddha Amitabha. And in this sect, one need only pray a single time to Buddha Amitabha, asking him earnestly, and if he so chooses, you will be reborn in the Pure Land. This doctrinal disagreement reminds me a lot more of Christianity and the squabbles in Catholicism over limbo and purgatory and hell. In one way, it's endearing. In another way, it's appalling. Either way, this is religion. The atheistic angle is not the only reason that many proclaim the virtues of Buddhism. It also has the reputation for being a peaceful religion, unlike the marauding warmongering that the Abrahamic religions gave rise to. But this is also a myth. There are countless examples of violence in Buddhism. In the 1990s, the Zen traditions of Japan issued public apologies for their history of war and for the role they played in World War II. In Myanmar, the country that preserved Vipassana meditation and spread it back into the world, Buddhists have started anti-Islamic Buddhist nationalist movements. This isn't just lay people, but is led by monks. Sri Lanka has a similarly dicey history of tensions between Buddhists and Muslims, with thousands dead, and once again we find Buddhist monks actively involved in the violence and persecution. Of course, Buddhism also has a history of peace and non-violence. There is the famous Emperor Ashoka and the self-immolation of monks protesting against the Vietnam War. But the bottom line is that Buddhism, like all religions, has blood on its hands. It has a history of violence that perhaps has been less prominent because of its lower penetration of the world's population, and because of having less friction points than other world religions. But where we find Buddhism shoulder to shoulder with other religions like Islam, quite often sparks fly just as they do further west. In conclusion, Buddhism is not an anomaly in world history. There is only one branch of Buddhism that can claim to be non-religious, atheistic and rational, and that is secular Buddhism. This recent branch is very far from being typical of Buddhism, and to claim that it is closer to the true teaching of the Buddha is not just condescending, but false. Advocates of this Buddhism is a philosophy worldview cherry-pick their favourite phrases from the Buddha to justify discarding the vast majority of the belief system he founded. In every Buddhist tradition, whether it be Theravadin or Mahayana in origin, there are, as in every world religion, a vast array of supernatural beliefs. Of course, there is a philosophical core to Buddhism. The same can be said of any world religion. Christianity could certainly be given the same treatment. Nietzsche, after all, once referred to Christianity as Platonism for the masses. There's a massive difference between the simple philosophy preached by Jesus and the things that go by the name Christianity. Seen from far enough away, Christianity has a philosophical allure. That's how it appears to many in the East, and it is how it appeared to the Romans, who found in it an alternative to Stoicism and Epicureanism. Whatever their value as philosophies, these belief systems are ultimately religions, and the philosophies that they expound are just one part of a greater context that has both sustained and oppressed their respective communities for over 2 millennia. The religious nature of Buddhism is not a cause for disappointment and disillusion. Religions are not merely glorified personal development programs or explanations of the world. The rich exoticism of all religious imagery serves as a grounding for morality and community, and provides a rich vein of meaning that orients its adherents towards a certain conception of an ideal life. The secular Buddhism of the West is vastly different to what we find in rich Oriental history of Buddhism. It has many benefits to offer: skills for managing stress, reducing negative emotions, and increasing focus. Anyone who offers you more than this is trying to have their cake and eat it too. They have ventured beyond the promises of Buddhism into salesmanship. That's everything for this episode of The Living Philosophy. If you enjoyed it, why not give it a thumbs up down below? And if you really enjoyed it, why not head over to Patreon, where you can support the channel, get your name in the credits, and much, much more. As ever, if you have any thoughts, insights, or feedback, I'd love to hear from you down in the comments. Otherwise, I shall see you next time. Thank you for watching.